Night settles over a small Judean village, and the darkness is thicker than anything we know today. Inside a low stone house, the flicker of a single oil lamp barely pushes back the shadows. A family huddles together on woven mats as cold air creeps through cracks in the walls. Somewhere in the distance, a child coughs, a harsh rattling sound that in this world could quietly mark the beginning of a tragedy. 2,000 years ago, the lands of Judea and Galilee were not the peaceful biblical landscapes many people imagine. They were places where survival itself was uncertain, where disease moved faster than knowledge, and where the wrong encounter with power could end a life in public humiliation. The age in which Jesus lived was not merely difficult. For many ordinary people, it may have been one of the harshest times to be alive. In the pale light before dawn, village life begins to stir. Women walk slowly toward the well, carrying clay jars balanced carefully on their heads, their faces already marked by years of labor and worry. Their quiet conversations drift through the morning air, rumors of new taxes, whispers about another man taken for unpaid debts, and stories of rebels recently crucified along the road. None of these fears are exaggerated. The Roman Empire dominates the Mediterranean world with unmatched power, and Judea sits uneasily beneath its shadow. Roman soldiers patrol the streets of Jerusalem, their presence a constant reminder that the land no longer truly belongs to the people who live there. But Roman rule is not felt only in soldiers and swords. It reaches deeply into the daily lives of ordinary families through something far more relentless: taxation. A farmer's harvest does not belong entirely to him. A significant portion disappears into a complex web of payments demanded by imperial authorities, local rulers, and religious institutions. Scholars estimate that a typical Jewish household might lose nearly a third, sometimes even 40% of its annual produce to these overlapping obligations. For wealthy landowners, this was an inconvenience. For subsistence farmers struggling to grow enough grain to survive the winter, it could mean the difference between feeding their children and watching them go hungry. The men who collected these taxes were often Jews themselves, hired to gather revenue for Rome. They were hated figures in village society, not only because they served the occupying power, but because the system encouraged corruption. Whatever extra money they could extract beyond the official amount often became their personal profit. And the economic pressure did not stop there. When villagers resisted Roman authority or failed to meet financial demands, land could be confiscated. Families who had cultivated the same fields for generations sometimes found themselves suddenly dispossessed, forced to work the land they once owned as tenants for wealthy elites. Slowly, a new social class began to grow across the region: landless peasants with little security and few options. Many drifted towards cities seeking day labor. Others remained in villages trapped in cycles of debt that could follow a family for generations. This harsh economic reality shaped nearly every decision people made about whom they married, how many children they had, even how much bread they dared to eat each day. Yet taxation and poverty were only the surface of a much deeper struggle. Beneath it lay a society governed by rigid hierarchies, fragile honor, and a constant fear that one mistake could destroy an entire family's future. In the villages of first-century Judea, a person's future was largely determined at birth. Society was arranged in steep layers that few people could ever climb. At the top stood powerful priestly families and wealthy landowners who often cooperated with Roman authority, maintaining influence through both religion and politics. Beneath them were merchants and skilled craftsmen who managed modest livelihoods in towns and growing cities. But they were a small minority. The overwhelming majority of the population consisted of peasant farmers, day laborers, fishermen, and shepherds whose survival depended entirely on the success of each season's work. And below even them existed those society preferred not to see. People suffering from visible diseases, the chronically poor, the disabled, and slaves occupied the very bottom of the social order. Their lives were often defined not only by hardship, but by exclusion. In this world, honor was more valuable than wealth. A family's reputation functioned almost like a form of currency, shaping marriage opportunities, business relationships, and social protection. Losing honor could mean more than embarrassment. It could mean isolation from the community that ensured survival. This made daily life intensely cautious. Every public action carried social consequences. A careless insult, a broken promise, or a perceived moral failure could damage a family's standing for generations. Meanwhile, the political situation surrounding these communities simmered with tension. Judea and Galilee were not peaceful provinces quietly accepting Roman rule. Beneath the surface, resentment and anger constantly threatened to erupt. Galilee, in particular, had a reputation for unrest. The region produced numerous revolutionary movements, hoping to drive Rome from the land. Some rebels operated openly. Others formed secret bands that waited for the right moment to strike. Rome responded to even small signs of rebellion with overwhelming brutality. Their preferred tool of intimidation was crucifixion, a punishment designed not simply to kill, but to terrify the population into obedience. Crucifixions were public spectacles. Victims were nailed or tied to wooden crosses along major roads where travelers could see them for days. The message was unmistakable. This is what happens to those who challenge Roman power. The Jewish historian Josephus recorded moments when hundreds of rebels were crucified at once after failed uprisings. For ordinary villagers walking dusty roads between towns, the sight of these bodies was not rare. It was a grim reminder that in this world power belonged to Rome, and resistance came with unimaginable consequences. Violence did not come only from the empire. Beyond the walls of towns and cities, the countryside itself could be dangerous. Roads winding through rocky hills often became hunting grounds for bandits, some driven by political rebellion, others simply by hunger and desperation. Travelers moved cautiously, especially along routes like the steep road descending from Jerusalem to Jericho. Narrow passes and jagged cliffs provided perfect places for ambush. A lone traveler carrying goods or coins could vanish without a trace. When Jesus later told a story about a man beaten and left half dead on that very road, his listeners would not have considered it unusual. They knew exactly how easily such a thing could happen. The danger was familiar, almost expected. Yet, despite this constant tension, ordinary people still tried to build lives filled with routine and stability. The center of survival was not the empire, nor the temple, but the family. Extended households formed tight networks of cooperation where grandparents, parents, children, and cousins often lived together or within a few steps of one another. In these close communities, survival depended on mutual support. Families shared tools, helped each other harvest crops, repaired roofs together, and stepped in when illness or injury struck. Without such cooperation, few could endure the hardships of the environment. Village life operated almost like a living organism. Everyone knew each other's business, and news traveled quickly along narrow streets. A wedding, a birth, or a death affected the entire community. The rhythm of each day followed the relentless demands of survival. Work began before sunrise when the cool air made labor slightly more bearable. For men and older boys, this usually meant walking to fields or vineyards, carrying simple tools worn smooth from years of use. Farming in much of Palestine was physically exhausting. The soil was thin and filled with stones, forcing farmers to break the ground slowly with wooden plows tipped with iron. Every harvest required hours of bending, cutting, and hauling under an unforgiving sun. Meanwhile, the work of the household began even earlier. Inside small homes, women and girls prepared the day's food by grinding grain into flour using heavy stone hand mills. The process required constant circular motion that could last for hours, day after day, year after year. Water added another burden to this already demanding routine. Wells were often the heart of a village, but they could also be some distance away. Carrying heavy jars of water back home, sometimes several times a day, was an essential task that quietly shaped the daily lives of women and children across the region. In dry regions where wells were scarce, the search for water could stretch into long, exhausting journeys. Clay jars filled with water could weigh more than 20 kilograms, and each careful step along dusty paths required balance and endurance. What seems like a simple task today was in that world a daily test of strength. The physical toll of life in first-century Palestine was written directly onto the human body. Archaeological studies of skeletal remains show worn joints, poorly healed fractures, and teeth damaged by years of grinding coarse bread filled with tiny stone particles from milling grain. Chronic pain was simply part of existence. There were no painkillers, no surgeries, and little understanding of infection. A broken bone might heal crookedly. A deep cut could quietly become fatal if bacteria spread through the body. Life expectancy reflects just how fragile life could be. Many people did not live past their mid-30s. This does not mean everyone died young, but the number is pulled downward by the devastating reality that many children never reached adulthood. Infant mortality was especially brutal. In some regions of the Roman world, nearly 1 out of every 3 children died before the age of 5. For families, joy and grief often walked side by side. Childbirth itself was one of the most dangerous moments in a woman's life. Without trained medical care, complications during delivery could quickly turn fatal. Entire households sometimes lived with the quiet memory of mothers or infants lost during birth. Even the homes people lived in offered little protection from these hardships. A typical dwelling was small, often a single room built of rough stone or sun-dried mud brick. The roof was made from wooden beams layered with branches and packed earth, forming a flat surface that sometimes doubled as a sleeping place during warm nights. Inside the space served many purposes at once. Families cooked, ate, worked, and slept within the same room. During colder seasons, animals might even be brought inside for warmth, filling the house with the smell and sounds of livestock. Smoke from indoor cooking fires slowly darkened the walls and ceiling. With limited ventilation, the air could grow thick and irritating to the lungs and eyes. Over time, this constant exposure contributed to respiratory problems that many people simply endured. The furniture was sparse. A small table, a few stools, storage jars, and woven mats for sleeping made up most of what a household owned. Yet within these modest spaces unfolded the entire emotional life of a family: meals, shared stories, told prayers spoken, and the quiet hope that tomorrow might be a little easier than today. Food itself reflected the fragile balance between survival and scarcity. For most people, the foundation of every meal was bread usually made from barley rather than the finer wheat reserved for wealthier households. The bread was dense and coarse, often baked on hot stones or in small clay ovens, shared between several families. Alongside bread came simple additions of lentils, chickpeas, onions, and sometimes cucumbers or herbs gathered from nearby fields. Olive oil added flavor and precious calories, but it was used carefully measured, drop by drop. Meat was a rarity for ordinary villagers. A lamb or goat might be slaughtered only during religious festivals or major celebrations. For many families, months could pass without tasting it. Even wine, commonly associated with the ancient Mediterranean, was not the luxury drink we might imagine. It was typically diluted with water and consumed in small amounts, partly because untreated water sources could easily carry disease. Most people ate just 2 meals a day, a modest breakfast and a larger meal late in the afternoon after work was finished. During lean seasons or years of poor harvest, those meals could shrink to 1. Clothing reflected the same simplicity. The basic garment was a tunic made from rough, woven wool or linen. It was essentially a rectangular piece of fabric with openings for the head and arms tied at the waist with a belt or cord. Over the tunic, people might wear a cloak, a larger cloth wrapped around the body that provides warmth at night and protection against wind or rain. For many individuals, these 2 garments were the only clothing they owned. Washing clothes was not a frequent task. Water had to be carried by hand and soap was scarce. Dust from roads and fields settled into fabric and the smell of sweat and smoke lingered constantly. Footwear offered little relief from the rough terrain. Sandals consisted of simple leather soles held by straps tied around the foot. Many children and even adults during certain seasons walked barefoot along rocky paths hardened by years of travel. All of this created a sensory world that modern people would find overwhelming. The sting of smoke in the eyes, the constant smell of animals and unwashed wool, the noise of donkeys braying and merchants shouting in crowded markets. Yet, within this demanding environment lived a man from Nazareth whose message would eventually echo across centuries. Jesus of Nazareth did not grow up removed from this world of hardship. He lived fully inside it. Known in the Gospels as a tekton, a term often translated as carpenter, but more accurately meaning builder or craftsman. He likely worked with both wood and stone shaping beams, doors, and structural frames for houses in nearby towns. Such work required strength and endurance. Construction in the ancient world was done without power tools or machines, relying instead on chisels, saws, ropes, and raw human effort. A builder's hands became thick with calluses, his muscles shaped by years of lifting and carving heavy materials. Like everyone else around him, Jesus would have walked long distances between villages along dusty paths baked hard by the sun. He drank from the same wells, ate the same coarse bread, and slept under the same simple roofs as the people who later gathered to hear him teach. Understanding this shared physical reality changes how we see his ministry. Jesus did not speak to crowds from the distance of privilege. He addressed people whose daily struggles he personally understood: the exhaustion of labor, the fear of illness, the uncertainty of tomorrow's meal. But the challenges of life in this world were not only physical. The cultural and religious system surrounding Jewish society was equally complex. At its center stood the Torah, the law which shaped nearly every aspect of daily life. The Torah was not simply a religious text read occasionally in worship. It functioned as a guide for living, regulating food cleanliness, business dealings, family relationships, and countless other details of ordinary existence. One of the most influential parts of this system involved the concepts of ritual purity. Certain substances, conditions, or encounters could render a person ritually unclean, not morally sinful, but temporarily separated from normal religious life. Contact with blood-dead bodies, certain animals, or visible diseases could require purification rituals before someone could fully participate again in community worship. These rules helped define boundaries within Jewish society and reinforced cultural identity in a world dominated by foreign powers. Yet these same purity regulations could also create powerful social barriers. People suffering from conditions like leprosy or chronic bleeding were often pushed to the margins of society, not only because of fear of disease, but because their condition made them ritually impure. This meant that illness carried a double burden. A sick person did not simply endure physical suffering, they often experienced isolation from family worship and normal social life. And it was precisely within this fragile and complicated world that Jesus began performing the acts that would soon draw enormous crowds. In villages across Galilee and Judea, sickness was not an occasional misfortune. It was an ever-present companion. Without antibiotics, sterile surgery, or reliable sanitation, diseases we barely notice today could spread rapidly and become deadly within days. Respiratory infections, stomach illnesses from contaminated water, infected wounds, and parasites were common realities. More serious diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, and leprosy circulated through communities with little resistance. Once symptoms appeared, there were few remedies beyond herbal treatments, prayer, and time. For families, the emotional weight of this constant vulnerability was immense. Parents expected that some of their children might not survive into adulthood. Death was not hidden behind hospital walls. It happened in the center of the household, surrounded by relatives who watched helplessly. This constant presence of suffering helps explain why healing stories in the Gospels carried such extraordinary power. When Jesus restored sight to the blind or enabled the lame to walk, these were not simply dramatic moments. They represented the reversal of conditions people believed were permanent. When he cleansed someone with leprosy, the impact went far beyond physical recovery. A person once forced to live outside the community could return home, embrace family members again, and participate in worship. Healing meant restoration to life itself. The same historical background sheds light on Jesus' teaching about daily provision. When he spoke the words, "Give us this day our daily bread," his listeners did not hear a poetic phrase. They heard a prayer that mirrored their most immediate concern whether tomorrow's food would exist at all. His message about wealth and poverty also struck directly at the economic realities surrounding his audience. When he said, "Blessed are the poor," he was addressing the majority of people standing before him. Farmers, laborers, widows, and fishermen who lived only one failed harvest away from disaster. Even his idea of the kingdom of God carried political and social meaning in that world. To people living under Roman domination and economic exploitation, the vision of a kingdom defined by justice, mercy, and service suggested a radically different order than the one they experienced every day. Seen against this harsh historical backdrop, the life of Jesus becomes even more striking. He did not appear in a time of comfort or stability. He entered a world where suffering, inequality, disease, and fear were woven into the fabric of daily existence. And perhaps that is precisely why his message spread so quickly. In an age that may have been one of the most difficult times to be alive, words of compassion, healing, and hope carried a weight that few other voices could offer, echoing across centuries, from a world that, despite its hardships, gave rise to one of history's most enduring stories.